The Royale was a paradise for the wealthy, where appearances mattered more than humanity. One night, a ragged stranger walked in, met with sneers, whispers, and outright humiliation. The staff laughed, mocking him, treating him like he was nothing. But what they didn't know, he owned the place. And by the end of the night, their world would come crashing down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. A cold breeze swept through the streets as Big Shaq adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack. His reflection in a nearby glass window was unrecognizable. His usual crisp suit and polished shoes were replaced with tattered clothes, his hair deliberately disheveled, his face slightly smudged with dirt. This wasn't just a disguise. It was a test. A test to see if the empire he had built carried the same values he believed in. The Royale stood tall under the city lights, its golden sign gleaming, the entrance lined with luxury cars. A place meant to symbolize excellence, warmth, and class. But tonight, Shaq wasn't walking in as its owner. He was stepping in as an outcast, an unwanted presence in a world that worshipped appearances. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the heavy glass doors open. The moment he stepped inside, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations slowed, eyes flicked toward him, and then came the expressions. Curious, judgmental, some outright disgusted. The scent of expensive wine and sizzling steaks filled the air, but the warmth didn't reach him. He could feel the invisible barrier being drawn between him and the rest of the restaurant. A young hostess, blonde and poised, stood behind the front podium. She barely glanced at him before lowering her gaze to the reservation book, pretending to be occupied. Shaq approached, his voice calm but firm. "Good evening. Table for one, please." The hostess, Brooke, lifted her head, her expression unreadable for a split second before her features hardened into forced politeness. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?" Shaq nodded. "Pretty sure." She hesitated, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, taking in the frayed jacket, the scuffed shoes, the old backpack slung over his shoulder. A shadow of amusement crossed her face before she sighed. "We're fully booked tonight." Shaq glanced around. Half the tables were empty. He arched a brow. "Fully booked?" Brooke stiffened. "Yes, sir. Reservations only." Before Shaq could say another word, a tall man in a tailored black suit emerged from the bar area. Tyler Graves, the restaurant manager. With sharp features and a cold smirk, he radiated authority, the kind that didn't welcome challenges. He took one look at Shaq, and his nose wrinkled slightly, as if catching a bad smell. "Is there a problem here?" Tyler asked, his voice smooth but laced with irritation. Brooke crossed her arms. "This gentleman is asking for a table, but I told him we're full." Tyler's gaze locked onto Shaq, assessing him the way one would examine a stray animal wandering into the wrong neighborhood. There was no kindness, no curiosity, just immediate rejection. Shaq held his ground. "I just want a meal. I can pay." Tyler let out a short, humorless laugh. "I doubt that." Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of bills. The moment the crisp notes were visible, a few onlookers raised their eyebrows. A woman in an elegant black dress leaned toward her companion, whispering something behind her manicured hand. The bartender, polishing a glass, scoffed audibly. "Probably fake," he muttered under his breath. Shaq ignored them. He looked Tyler dead in the eyes. "Still doubt it?" For a second, Tyler was silent. His smirk faltered just a little before he recovered. "It's not just about money," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "We have an image to uphold." Shaq tilted his head. "And what image is that?" Tyler's lips curled upward, but his eyes remained cold. "Exclusivity, quality, a certain standard." He gestured subtly toward Shaq's clothes, his posture relaxed but his words sharp. "And we can't just let anyone waltz in here, can we?" Shaq exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. Disappointed, maybe, but not surprised. He had built this place from the ground up, had chosen every detail with care. The Royale wasn't meant to be just a luxury restaurant. It was supposed to be a place where food and hospitality knew no status, where excellence didn't come at the cost of kindness. And yet, here he was, standing in his own establishment, being told he wasn't good enough to sit at one of his own tables. "One meal," Shaq said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "That's all I'm asking for." Shaq followed the direction of Tyler's finger. The table in question was half broken, shoved into a dimly lit corner next to a service station where waiters dumped dirty dishes. A busboy wiped his hands on a stained rag before placing a chipped plate down. The smell of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air. Shaq's jaw tensed, but he nodded. "I'll take it." Tyler's smirk widened, but he said nothing as he turned on his heel and walked away. Brooke gave Shaq a final once-over before shaking her head and returning to her podium. Shaq made his way to the table, his every step followed by whispers. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing against his back, the silent amusement of some diners, the quiet discomfort of others. He had expected discrimination, but experiencing it firsthand, especially in his own restaurant, was something else entirely. A waiter appeared moments later, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes. Unlike the others, his expression wasn't cruel, just indifferent. "What do you want?" he asked, placing a single menu on the table without opening it. Shaq met his gaze. "What do you recommend?" The waiter hesitated, then sighed. "Soup of the day is cheap." Shaq gave a small, humorless smile. "I'll take it." The waiter grunted in acknowledgement and walked away. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table's scratched surface. He had seen enough. The Royale had failed his test. He took one last glance around the restaurant. The opulence, the dim golden lights, the elegant plating. None of it mattered if the people running it lacked basic humanity. They had no idea who he was, but soon, they would. Shaq sat at the small, forgotten table near the restroom, his fingers tracing the cracks on the surface. The soft hum of conversation filled the restaurant, but his presence had shifted the air. It was no longer just a place for fine dining. It had become a stage, and every person inside was watching how this scene would unfold. Some looked on with curiosity, some with amusement, and others with indifference. No one intervened. A few minutes passed before Brooke, the hostess, sauntered toward his table, a practiced smile on her lips. Her eyes, however, held nothing but disdain. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but ensuring it was still loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Sir, this isn't a soup kitchen," she said, her words dripping with mock concern. A couple of diners chuckled softly, entertained by the exchange. Shaq met her gaze, unblinking. "I never said it was." Brooke's smile tightened. She straightened, exhaling sharply, as if exhausted from dealing with him. "Look, I'm just trying to save you the embarrassment. This is the Royale. It's not exactly your kind of place." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "My kind?" Before she could answer, the bartender, a tall man with a slicked back ponytail and a permanent smirk, called out from behind the counter. "Let's be real. Even if he had money, it's gotta be fake. Beggars don't carry cash like that." He shook his head, pouring a drink for a customer who was only half paying attention, his focus more on the unfolding scene. Shaq exhaled slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same stack of crisp bills he had shown earlier. He placed them carefully on the table, the green of the notes stark against the dull wood. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Check it." For a brief moment, Brooke hesitated. The money was real, and she knew it. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that she had judged him unfairly. Her lips parted as if to say something, but before she could, a new voice cut in. Tyler Graves, the restaurant manager, stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He moved with confidence, the kind that came from years of authority, unchecked. The moment he arrived, Brooke straightened, and the bartender fell silent. Tyler's presence demanded attention. He looked Shaq over slowly, his expression one of pure revulsion. "What's going on here?" Tyler asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Brooke folded her arms, shifting her weight to one side. "He's insisting on a table," she said, her voice laced with annoyance. Tyler turned his gaze to Shaq, studying him like an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. "We have a reputation to maintain," he said finally, his tone casual but laced with venom. We don't serve people like you. Shaq remained still. People like me? Tyler smirked, his teeth flashing in a way that made it clear he enjoyed the power he held in this moment. Yeah, he said, as if explaining something obvious. Freeloaders, street rats. The words landed heavily, not just on Shaq, but on the room itself. A few customers exchanged glances. A woman at the corner table looked visibly uncomfortable, but she didn't speak. Another man, dressed in a tailored navy suit, sipped his wine slowly, watching with mild interest. No one defended Shaq. Shaq's jaw tensed slightly. Not in anger, but in control. He had expected discrimination, expected cruelty, but hearing it so openly, so shamelessly, was different. He had built this place from the ground up, yet here he was, treated like an intruder. He let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of their own words. And then, in the calmest voice possible, he asked, "If I were wearing a suit, would you serve me?" Tyler scoffed. "That's not the point." "But it is," Shaq countered. "Because if I were in a suit standing right here, you wouldn't question my money. You wouldn't call me a freeloader. You'd probably ask if I wanted the wine list." A muscle in Tyler's jaw twitched, but he recovered quickly. "Look," he said, glancing around as if tired of the conversation. "I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. And the rule is, we serve the kind of clientele that fits this establishment." Shaq leaned forward slightly. "You mean rich people?" Tyler smirked again. "I mean people who belong here." Shaq nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words. He glanced at the other employees. Brooke, standing with her arms crossed, her smirk barely concealed. The bartender still polishing a glass as if this was just another night. The waiter who had brought him the menu earlier, avoiding eye contact. Then Shaq did something unexpected. He pushed back his chair, stood up and looked around the restaurant. Every eye was on him, but no one spoke. He took in the chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the crisp white tablecloths. Everything was pristine, elegant. And yet, beneath all of that, the rot was visible. He reached into his pocket one last time, pulling out a single $100 bill. He placed it gently on the table and turned to Brooke. "That should cover my water," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room with a quiet authority. Brooke blinked, momentarily thrown off. Then, without another word, Shaq turned and walked toward the exit. The weight of the entire restaurant followed him, but he didn't look back. As he pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping into the cool night air, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. It was time to make a call. Shaq sat in silence, fingers tapping lightly against the worn-out table. The scent of grilled steak and aged wine filled the air, yet all he tasted was bitterness. He had expected judgment, but the sheer cruelty unfolding around him was worse than anticipated. Lifting his head, he caught glimpses of the restaurant's patrons. Some looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others whispered, amused by his humiliation. A few seemed uncomfortable, but none dared to speak up. He turned back to Brooke, the hostess still hovering near his table, her smirk unwavering. "Can I at least get a glass of water?" he asked evenly. Rolling her eyes, she walked off and returned moments later, slamming a cloudy fingerprint-smudged glass in front of him. "Something wrong?" she taunted. Shaq didn't answer. He exhaled through his nose and reached for the glass, but before he could take a sip, a voice scoffed loudly behind him. "Unbelievable," sneered Oscar, the head chef, emerging from the kitchen. His spotless white jacket and polished demeanor stood in sharp contrast to his cruel words. "If we start feeding strays," Oscar said, ensuring everyone heard, "this place will turn into a shelter." A few customers chuckled. Shaq tightened his grip around the glass, but remained composed. "Strays, huh?" he said, his voice calm, eyes locking onto Oscar's. The chef folded his arms, smirking. "Just calling it like I see it." The tension in the restaurant thickened. Then came the final blow. Tyler, the arrogant manager, approached slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His smirk oozed condescension as he reached down and picked up the glass with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. "Actually," Tyler said, placing the glass on a passing waiter's tray, "I changed my mind," You can leave now. Silence. Shaq didn't react at first. He sat still, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he rose. The shift was almost imperceptible, but the air in the room changed. He was no longer the silent, dismissed man they had ridiculed. There was something powerful simmering beneath his composed exterior. His gaze swept across the room, taking in every detail. The diners who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the ones who had wanted to speak but didn't. Brooke, now tense. Oscar, his confidence faltering. Tyler, still holding on to his bravado. You sure about that? Shaq asked, voice quieter now but deadly in its calmness. Tyler chuckled, though it sounded forced. Yeah, I'm sure. Shaq held his stare a moment longer, then nodded. With one last glance at the room, he turned and walked toward the exit. As the glass doors swung open, he stepped into the cold night air, inhaling deeply. Then, reaching into his jacket, he pulled out his phone, dialing a single number. His voice remained steady. It's time. And with that, the night was about to take a very different turn. Shaq stepped into the cold night air, inhaling deeply as he let the weight of the last hour settle in his chest. He had come to the Royale to test his staff, only to find arrogance, cruelty, and unchecked power ruling his establishment. He had expected indifference, but the humiliation, the sneers, and the outright disdain had been worse than he imagined. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed a single number. His voice was calm, composed. It's time. Within minutes, the low rumble of engines broke the night's silence. Black SUVs rolled up to the entrance, sleek and ominous. The valets, once laughing among themselves, stiffened. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was entirely different. Tyler, whiskey in hand, laughed loudly at the bar. Brooke smirked as she recounted their little show. Oscar, the chef, mimicked Shaq's quiet endurance, drawing chuckles from the other staff. They believed they had won. Then, the doors swung open. The laughter died instantly. Conversations stopped, every head turned. Shaq walked in, not hunched, not hesitant, but with a presence that made the room shrink. Gone was the weary man in tattered clothes. Now he stood tall, shoulders squared, adjusting the sleeve of his expensive suit. The aura of a billionaire, of a man who built empires, settled over him effortlessly. Flanking him were men in tailored suits, their expressions unreadable, their presence radiating quiet authority. Some held briefcases, others simply stood, their silence louder than any words. Tyler blinked rapidly, his smirk faltering. What's happening? He stammered, his grip tightening around his glass. Shaq's gaze locked onto him. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously calm. I own this place, he said. And now we need to talk. Brooke paled. The bartender swallowed hard. Oscar found the floor suddenly fascinating. Murmurs spread through the guests. Some discreetly raised their phones, recording what they knew was an unforgettable moment. Tyler scrambled for control. Listen, this is all just a big misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were. Shaq arched a brow. And that justifies it? Tyler's mouth opened, but no sound came. Shaq exhaled, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of their actions settle in. He turned to Brooke. You enjoyed yourself tonight, didn't you? Brooke's lips parted, but no words came. Next, his gaze landed on Oscar. If we start feeding strays, this place will turn into a shelter, he repeated. That's what you said, right? Oscar visibly flinched. Finally, Shaq turned back to Tyler. You thought you got rid of some nobody who didn't belong here, he said. Well, let me tell you something, Tyler. You don't belong here anymore. Tyler's face drained of color. Wait. Shaq raised a hand. Effective immediately. You're done. The two security personnel flanking him stepped forward. Tyler staggered back, panic in his eyes. No, please, just let me explain. The restaurant doors swung open once more as Tyler was dragged outside, his shouts fading into the night. Shaq turned to Brooke. Your fake politeness won't work anymore. You're out. She didn't argue. She simply walked away. Then to Oscar. You don't respect people, so I don't respect you. Pack your things. You're done. Oscar clenched his jaw but nodded stiffly before vanishing into the kitchen. Shaq turned to the rest of the staff, the ones who had stood by, silent. You get a choice, he said. Step up and be better, or leave. Some left. Others straightened their backs, ready to change. Shaq gave a slow nod. Then let's fix this place. And with that, the Royale would never be the same again. The restaurant was no longer filled with quiet elegance. It had erupted into chaos. Hushed whispers rippled through the crowd, murmurs of disbelief spreading like wildfire. Customers clutched their drinks, their eyes darting between Shaq and the staff, while others discreetly lifted their phones, recording every second of what was unfolding before them. Tyler stood frozen, his face pale, his mind scrambling for a way to undo what had just happened. This is a joke, right? He blurted, his voice uneven. Shaq didn't blink. You tell me. His voice was calm, yet it held a weight that made the air thick with tension. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Shaq stepped forward, his towering presence now impossible to ignore. His gaze swept across the room, pausing at each person who had taken part in his humiliation. He wasn't speaking just to punish them. He wanted them to feel what they had done. Let's go over a few things, shall we? His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. He turned to Brooke first, his eyes piercing through her fake confidence. You said this wasn't a soup kitchen. Brooke's lips trembled, her earlier arrogance evaporating under his stare. She clutched her hands together, as if bracing for what was coming next. Then, Shaq's gaze shifted to the bartender. And you, he continued, his voice unwavering. You said my money had to be fake. Because, what? A man who looks like me couldn't possibly afford to eat here? The bartender's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, but he didn't dare respond. Next, Shaq turned to Oscar, the head chef, who stood with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes glued to the floor. And you, Shaq said, his tone darkening. You called me a stray. You said feeding people like me would turn this place into a shelter. Oscar's jaw tensed, but he remained silent. The confidence he had displayed just moments ago had vanished. Finally, Shaq faced Tyler, the man who had orchestrated it all. The one who had stood by and encouraged the humiliation, believing he was untouchable. Tyler tried to recover, forcing a shaky laugh as he spread his hands in a weak attempt at control. Listen, he started, his voice lighter, as if he could play this off. We were just... Shaq cut him off before he could finish. Just what? Testing people like me? He took a deliberate step forward. The people who pay your salary? Silence. Tyler swallowed hard, his earlier confidence draining from his face. He opened his mouth again, but no words came. Shaq turned to the remaining staff, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had watched everything unfold but had done nothing. His eyes scanned them, his expression unreadable. Why didn't you stop them? His voice was quieter now, but it cut even deeper. The weight of his question hung in the air. The servers, the bussers, the junior kitchen staff, they all shifted uncomfortably, but no one had an answer. You saw everything, Shaq continued, his tone steady. You heard everything, and you stayed quiet. A young waitress at the far end of the room bit her lip, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked like she wanted to say something, but fear kept her rooted in place. Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the silence linger. He wasn't here just to fire people. He was here to make them understand. And then, he made his move. He turned back to Tyler, his expression unwavering. You don't deserve to run this place, he said, his voice final. You're fired. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Tyler's eyes widened, his face twisting with panic. Wait, hold on, he stammered, stepping forward. Let's be reasonable here. I didn't know who you were. Shaq's expression remained unchanged. And that's the problem. Two security personnel, who had been waiting near the entrance, stepped forward. Their presence alone was enough to make Tyler stumble back. No, please, just let me explain, Tyler pleaded. But it was too late. The security guards flanked him, gripping his arms. His struggles were futile as they guided him toward the exit. The restaurant doors swung open, and the last thing anyone heard from Tyler was his frantic protests before he was forced outside. Shaq turned to Brooke next. She had gone pale, her earlier confidence crumbling before everyone's eyes. "Your fake politeness?" Shaq said, his tone sharp. "Won't work anymore. You're done." Brooke's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no coming back from this. Then, Shaq's gaze shifted to Oscar. The chef, who had once strutted through the kitchen with arrogance, now stood rigid, his hands gripping the edges of his apron. "You don't respect people," Shaq said, his voice firm. "So I don't respect you. Pack your things. You're out." Oscar clenched his jaw, but he nodded stiffly and turned away, heading straight for the kitchen. He knew better than to fight. The restaurant was deathly silent now, all eyes on Shaq, waiting for what he would do next. He looked at the remaining staff, the ones who hadn't joined in the cruelty, but had also done nothing to stop it. He could see the guilt on their faces, the realization settling in. "You don't get fired," Shaq said finally, "but you get a choice." He let his words sink in before continuing. "Step up and be better, or walk out." A few employees looked at each other, uncertainty clouding their faces. Some hesitated before quietly removing their aprons, setting them on the counter, and walking toward the exit. They didn't try to make excuses, they simply left. But some stayed. Some straightened their postures, their eyes reflecting a silent promise to change. Shaq gave them a nod. Then, he turned to one of his legal advisors, who had been standing silently at his side. "Find me a new restaurant manager," Shaq instructed. "Someone who actually understands respect." The advisor nodded, already pulling out his phone. As the tension in the air began to settle, Shaq's eyes landed on a young employee, a waiter who had kept his head down the entire time. Something about him seemed different from the others. Shaq had noticed the subtle hesitations, the way he had stolen glances at Shaq earlier, as if struggling with his conscience. "You!" Shaq called out. The young man's head snapped up, his body stiffening. "Yes, sir?" Shaq studied him for a moment before asking, "What's your name?" "James," the waiter replied, his voice nervous. Shaq nodded slowly. "I've heard that you've covered meals for struggling customers before. Is that true?" James swallowed hard, then gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." Shaq's lips curved slightly. "Good," he said. "You're the new manager." The restaurant collectively gasped. James's eyes widened in shock. Me? Shaq nodded. "Someone like you should have been running this place all along." James stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, he straightened his back, his expression shifting from disbelief to determination. Shaq turned back to the restaurant, scanning the space that would now change under his leadership. He had come here looking for answers, and he had found them. But more importantly, he had ensured that the Royale would never again be a place where people were judged by their appearances. With a final glance at his new team, he exhaled deeply. "Let's fix this place." The restaurant was silent, heavy with shock. The weight of what had just unfolded lingered in the air, pressing down on every person who had been part of the night's cruelty. Shaq stood at the center, his presence alone commanding respect. There was no shouting, no need for threats. The shift in power was undeniable. Tyler was already gone, dragged out by security, his protests swallowed by the cold night air. The customers, still processing the revelation, whispered among themselves. Some had laughed at the homeless man earlier. Now they sat frozen, realizing they had witnessed something far greater than a social experiment. They had watched justice unfold in real time. Shaq turned his gaze to Brooke, the once smirking hostess now trembling under his stare. The false charm she had weaponized against him was gone. Now she was just another employee facing the consequences of her own choices. "You," Shaq said, his tone calm but final. "Your fake politeness won't work anymore." Brooke's breath hitched. Her lips parted, perhaps to plead, but no words came. She already knew there was no saving herself. "You're done," Shaq finished. A sharp exhale escaped her lips as she looked around, hoping for someone to defend her. No one did. Shoulders slumped, She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the floor like the final echoes of her downfall. Shaq's focus shifted next to Oscar, the arrogant head chef who had mocked him, who had openly stated that feeding people like him would turn the Royale into a shelter. Unlike Brooke, there was no fear in Oscar's face, only a tight jaw, his pride warring with reality. "You don't respect people," Shaq said. "So I don't respect you." Oscar didn't flinch, but his fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You're out," Shaq finished. For a moment, Oscar didn't move. Then with a sharp exhale, he untied his apron, tossed it onto the counter, and strode toward the kitchen. The doors swung violently as he disappeared, the sound of clattering dishes punctuating his exit. Shaq turned to the remaining staff, the ones who had stood by in silence, who had seen everything yet had chosen to do nothing. "You don't get fired," he said, "but you get a choice." A ripple of tension passed through the employees. "Step up and be better," Shaq continued, his gaze scanning their faces. "Or walk out." Some hesitated, then sighed, removing their aprons before quietly making their way to the exit. They knew they had failed the test. But some stayed. Their faces were tense, uncertain, but their feet stayed planted. Shaq nodded slightly. They could be taught. Then he did something no one expected. He turned to a young waiter near the bar, a man who had looked uncomfortable during the earlier events, but had been too afraid to speak. "You!" Shaq called. The waiter stiffened. "Me?" Shaq nodded. "What's your name?" "James," the young man answered quickly, his voice tight. "I heard you've covered meals for struggling customers before," Shaq said. "Is that true?" James flushed slightly, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Shaq studied him for a moment. "Why?" James hesitated before answering. "Because it felt like the right thing to do." Shaq didn't reply immediately. He turned to one of his legal advisors. "Find me a new restaurant manager," he instructed. James shifted uncomfortably, then cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, we already have someone." Shaq arched a brow. "Who?" James hesitated, but then spoke. "Me." Murmurs spread across the room. James looked like he regretted speaking, but his eyes held something different, conviction. Shaq regarded him carefully. He had seen arrogance and cruelty tonight. But now, for the first time, he was seeing something else. "Do you think you can run this place?" Shaq asked. James hesitated, then nodded firmly. "Yes." Shaq exhaled, letting the moment stretch before nodding. "Then you're the new manager." A wave of disbelief passed through the remaining employees. James's eyes widened. "Me?" "You," Shaq confirmed. "Someone like you should have been running this place all along." James stood still for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then, slowly, his posture straightened, determination replacing hesitation. Shaq turned to the rest of the staff. "This restaurant will never treat people like that again." The Royale had been given a second chance, and under new leadership, it would finally become what it was always meant to be. The lesson: respect costs nothing. 1,500 words. The Royale was no longer the same place it had been a month ago. The grandeur remained. The chandeliers still cast a warm golden glow. The marble floors still gleamed, and the scent of gourmet dishes still filled the air. But something intangible had changed, something that could not be measured in dollars or luxury. The staff, once tainted by arrogance and indifference, had undergone a complete transformation. The cruel smirks and forced politeness had been replaced with genuine warmth. The sneering glances were gone, replaced by eyes that saw every customer as a person rather than a price tag. It was no longer just about service. It was about dignity. Policies had changed from the ground up. Every staff member was retrained, not just in hospitality, but in humanity. New hires were chosen based on kindness, just as much as skill. And most importantly, a new rule had been put into place. One that would forever define what the Royale stood for. 1 free meal a day. No questions asked. If someone truly needed it, they would get it. No judgment, no sneers, no humiliation. Just a plate of food and a place to sit, treated with the same respect as any high-paying customer. It had taken time, effort, and unlearning years of silent prejudice. But the Royale had finally become what it was always meant to be. Shaq had kept his distance during the transformation, watching from afar as James, the new manager, stepped into his role with quiet determination. The young man had taken the challenge head-on, setting a standard for the rest of the employees. And now, it was time to see the change for himself. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, Shaq pushed open the familiar glass doors and stepped inside. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Gone were the stiff, judgmental glances. Gone were the hushed whispers when someone who didn't belong walked in. The energy of the restaurant felt lighter, welcoming. Staff members moved with purpose, but without the air of superiority that had once poisoned this place. A hostess, a new hire who had replaced Brooke, smiled warmly as she approached. "Welcome to the Royale, sir. Table for one?" Shaq nodded. "Yes, please." He was led to a table near the window, where the city lights stretched across the skyline. As he settled into his seat, a waiter arrived with a menu. "Good evening, sir. My name is Daniel, and I'll be taking care of you today," the young man said, placing the menu down. "Would you like to start with something to drink?" Shaq glanced up at him, searching for any trace of hesitation, any sign that the old habits lingered beneath the surface. But there was none. Daniel's demeanor was professional, attentive, and most importantly, genuine. "I'll take a glass of water," Shaq said, the hint of a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Of course, sir. I'll be right back," Daniel replied before walking away. Shaq leaned back in his chair, letting his gaze wander across the room. Customers dined, laughed, and conversed without tension in the air. There was no separation between who belonged and who didn't. Everyone was simply a guest. Then the doors opened, and a hush of recognition spread through the room. An old man shuffled inside, his steps slow but purposeful. His clothes were worn, his hands weathered, and his eyes carried the weight of years spent struggling. He was the kind of man who, just a month ago, would have been turned away without a second thought. Shaq watched, waiting. James, standing near the bar, noticed the man immediately. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, offering the same warm smile that had greeted Shaq. "Welcome to the Royale, sir," James said, his voice kind and steady. "Would you like a table?" The old man hesitated, as if expecting resistance. I don't have money," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. James didn't flinch. "That's all right," he said simply. "Let's get you something to eat." The old man's lips parted slightly in surprise. He looked around waiting for someone to object. But no one did. No staff member sneered. No customer whispered in disapproval. A waitress, carrying a tray of dishes, glanced at the scene. Without hesitation, she walked over to an empty table and set a menu down. "Right this way, sir," she said with a smile. Still wary, the old man slowly followed. He lowered himself into the chair, looking unsure if this was real. Shaq exhaled, a sense of pride settling in his chest. This was it. This was the change he had been waiting to see. Daniel returned with Shaq's glass of water, placing it gently on the table. "Are you ready to order, sir?" Shaq glanced at the menu but barely needed to look. "I'll have the steak," he said, then motioned toward the old man across the room. "And whatever he wants. Put it on my tab." Daniel smiled, nodding. "Of course, sir." As Shaq took a sip of his water, he watched as a steaming plate of food was placed in front of the old man. The man looked at it as if it were a dream, his hands hovering over the silverware, unsure if he was really allowed to eat. James walked by, pausing beside Shaq's table. "You did good," Shaq said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. James smiled. "I had a good teacher." Shaq chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No," he corrected. "You just had the right heart." James gave a small nod before walking back to oversee the restaurant. Shaq watched as the old man finally took his first bite, closing his eyes as he chewed. There was no hesitation now, no doubt, just the simple, unspoken understanding that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. This time no one sneered, no one whispered, no one refused to serve. Because respect wasn't about money. It wasn't about appearance. It was about character. As Shaq finished his meal, He placed his napkin on the table and stood up, adjusting his suit. The Royale no longer needed him to step in and correct its course. It had found its way. And as he walked toward the exit, the screen faded to black. Final text appeared. The way you treat those with nothing says everything about who you are. Respect costs nothing, but its impact lasts forever. The way we treat others, especially those with nothing, reveals who we truly are. Next time you see someone struggling, choose kindness over judgment. Stand up when you witness injustice. Because true power isn't in wealth or status, it's in the way we lift others up. So ask yourself, if you were tested today, would you pass?